This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1077, Book of the Month Club, The Uncanny X-Men, and the New Teen Titans.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. This is episode 1077. It's another Book of the Month Club. This time we're doing something a little bit different. We're taking yet another break from the Clone Saga to talk about Marvel and DC present The Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans. For those who want to read along at home, this is in the recently published DC vs. Marvel Omnibus, not to be confused with its sister title, the DC vs. Marvel Amalgamage Omnibus. Very excited to talk about this. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. I'm joined, as always, on the Book of the Month Clubs by Nathan Struck, and we're going to talk about some crossover, a particular crossover. So, Nate, I guess the first question is, prior to this reading, had you ever read this material before, this fabled crossover, this crossover that everyone says was really done right and makes people sad that there was never a sequel back in the day, in the 80s? You got the two biggest teams of the time, the New Teen Titans and the Uncanny X-Men. Had you read this before?
No, in fact, the cover is faintly familiar to me, so maybe I saw would it have been a maxi series? How was this collected originally? Was it just a floppy issue?
Yeah, it was just a big issue.
Okay, so I think I'm familiar enough with the cover that I had seen it before, but it just never tickled my fancy. And I mean, to be honest, I haven't really been on the whole Claremont project trying to read all his stuff until the last few years. And so once I started kind of going, you know what, I'm going to get in and get all the epics and be able to read his as much as possible, all his Uncanny issues. This was not even a blip on my radar. So to hear that this was, I mean, not only collected in this DC Marvel omnibus, but that this would be a standout for me, right? And maybe the only way for me to own this in any kind of collected edition. Well, certainly the only way to own it in a collected edition, because these projects don't come around very often, right? Between DC and Marvel doing reprints. So I would rather not have floppies for some reason. I try to have a shelf with spines as much as I can. That's kind of my project. So that was really, it was the tipping point for me. Just this one series, I was happy to kind of have a bunch of the other ones. I've really never read any of these. The Spider-Man, Batman is of interest to me, the one that Bagley draws. The Kyle Rayner crossover with Silver Surfer is of interest to me. But this is the one that kind of had me go, yeah, I'll buy this Omni. So I'm glad to have it now, but have never read it. This is my first time.
It's interesting. I don't know if there was anything in this volume that was really, in this omnibus that we're talking about, that was really a motivator for me to get it. I think it was just the cumulative nature of having all of them, all these different crossovers throughout the years, of which I had read a number of them, but definitely not all of them. And some of them, it's been so long, and to have them all on my shelf is really nice and special. I did feel like, not to kind of give too much spoilers on how I will feel later, when I would flip through this book to get to the issue that we're going to be talking about, I was a little sad each time that we weren't doing Superman, Spider-Man. That every time my page, I saw some of those pages. Obviously it's a 70s book, but looking at it and feeling like both Superman and Spider-Man so well, I was excited every time. I'm like, oh wait, that's not what we're talking about.
Oh no.
We're talking about something else. Now, to be fair to that Spider-Man Superman crossover, obviously that was a first of its time. You had Jerry Conway writing it. Obviously he had written Spider-Man. He ended up writing a lot of stuff for DC, including Justice League. He had Ross Andrew doing the art. It just looks gorgeous. So it's nothing, no shade against New Teen Titans and X-Men, but there's just something about whenever I would see those pages, I'm like, oh man, I wish that's what we were talking about. I wish I had an extra reason to read this right now. Anyways, I kept flipping and instead went to the Uncanny X-Men New Teen Titans, which at the time, two biggest team books of the 80s. It's so fascinating to look back on it that, you think the X-Men would team up with I don't know, the Justice League, or I guess that's more of an Avengers thing, but it's interesting that would have been the corollary at the time, where I don't think these days you would see that. If there was a theoretical crossover between two big teams, I doubt it would be the Teen Titans these days.
Especially at this time, because like Kitty's the only teen on the team. I mean, okay, I guess Colossus is 19. Not really a team full of teens at that point anymore, but yeah, they still certainly appeal to teens, and also that magic kind of that 80s era of these two books, and then throw in some Daredevil, and you get Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Like, these are the books that clearly heavily inspired Eastman and Laird, so that's kind of fun to, find this, what I'm going to call, spoilers, a gem, which is not really news, I suppose, to most people, but to see that this is a crossover that I really enjoyed, and to, read more 80s stuff and get a feeling of that zeitgeist is pretty thrilling for me. I do love to see that and get the references and see the hair, and I don't know. I like to imagine myself transported back to the 80s as I read this.
Now, what was prior to kind of reading this crossover, how much prior interaction had you had with the Teen Titans side of the equation?
Almost none. I don't even know why they're called the New Teen Titans. I would assume it means that there was an old Teen Titans. I hope the book before that was called The Old Teen Titans. That would be a nice kind of oxymoron there. But I assume that Wolfman and Perez reimagined the team. Maybe, what was it originally? Just like the stock kind of like Superboy, Robin kind of thing going on?
It was the basic, it was Wonder Girl, Robin, Speedy,
Aqualad?
Flash, Aqualad, I believe, was on there. There was a Teen Titans book by Bob Haney, and it did get very much revitalized by Wolfman and Perez. And the big thing that they obviously added was they brought in new characters like Cyborg and Starfire. And I guess Changeling had already been around, I believe, but he hadn't been a Teen Titan. So these were all kind of new things for that book. I believe Raven was also their creation for Teen Titans as well. This is an interesting, because I think I had always read about this crossover, and when I actually read it, I was actually surprised that it was just Claremont. In my mind, I thought it was going to be like a co-written joint between him and Wolfman or something like that, where both sides were represented in terms of the writing style, and obviously that's not what happened. And even the art feels decidedly more Marvel of the time than I would say DC. So it definitely feels like much more of a Marvel production than it feels like anything else. Which makes sense also when you look at the creative team, right? The actual editor is Louise Jones, and then Wheezy, but they're coordinating with DC and Len Wein, but they're not really as involved. So it's interesting. I felt more of that as I went through that, this is really just a Marvel book that happens to throw in some DC characters, and it doesn't feel like it really taps into all of who those characters are. Even the use of Darkseid as the villain feels very like askew for these characters and what they would usually go up against. There's no Trigon. Like, yes, there's Deathstroke, but you don't have a traditional big bad that would be more of a Teen Titans villain, I guess more of a DC villain, but even at this time, not as much, because they hadn't really started using Darkseid in that way yet.
For me, I'm not the what if reader that you are, that your son is, and I know a lot of people are, and they love What If. Like, I haven't even really engaged with anything past an episode or two in the second season of the Disney Plus series, let alone even touch season 3 yet. I don't know, it's just something about Elseworld stuff that doesn't, I don't know, I'm kind of weird I'm a weird continuity guy. And I also get to, in my head, decide, I think, what alt continuity is interesting to me or not, which again is bizarre. Like, even with who's the writer on the recent Transformers run that's been very lauded?
Daniel Warren Johnson.
As the time of this recording, he's just finishing up, or he's still writing it?
He's still writing as of this recording. I think he's got 6 issues left or more.
And the art's fun, and it's a poppy story, and it's kind of got some good energy to it, and I can see the quality of it, but I just find myself not caring. And everyone's raving about it, and they love it, and I'm just like, for some reason in my mind, it's the old U.S. Marvel continuity for Transformers, or the series, or the Japanese series, or the UK comics. Those are like the 4 pools that I'll be like, oh, that's okay, that's Transformer continuity, which again is silly, because there's so many stories, right? So I just have these comfort levels with what I decide. And so for me, my what ifs, the ones that I prefer, maybe it's because of my teenage years with DC versus Marvel, is this stuff. Like, I'm drawn to these fun, silly crossovers that don't mean anything. And I didn't even understand the premise, right? Because like in DC versus Marvel, it's like, well, there's an axis of worlds and they kind of get smooshed together, but they were separate originally, that there is a DC continuity and Marvel continuity and they kind of get blended. But this, and then I was like, why is New York the New York for both teams? Why did the Teen Titans know about the X-Men? Why are the X-Men referencing the Justice League? Like, what is going on here? And my understanding is that for many, if not all of these DC crossovers, they just decide we're not going to bother explaining how they come together. We're just going to jump into the action and pretend that they know each other. And certainly that's the case with this story, where they're just like coexisting, but Claremont's referencing continuity things from comics that aren't in this universe. So you just have to go ahead with it and jump on board. But it is odd because, again, with DC versus Marvel, there's this painstaking, kind of like The Rock and Vin Diesel, and they're kind of almost like their contracts in the Fast and the Furious movies will stipulate each one of them has to throw an equal number of punches, and neither one of them can take more punches than the other. And right, like they're how on par they have to be because they're managers, their contracts, they're all this machismo. Same kind of thing with like the Expendables, like. No one superstar or action hero can seem more dominant than the other. Jason Statham and The Rock can never be actually, out of balance. And yet, yeah, this is basically a Marvel creative team, and also Len Wein was there. And then the credits page has a giant, and now a word or two from Kitty Pryde in this kind of very cutesy, Monty Python-esque way. Marvel Comics is power. This gigantic, block text with Kitty next to it, and she says, and we're cute too. So it's a giant ad for Marvel that happens to have DC characters in it. Like, it's so dominant in terms of its Marvel personality, or at least the way that it's presented, that I found it confusing in many ways, right? I got into it. I kind of just stopped thinking too much about that as I was reading, but I was not prepared for how fast and loose they seem to play with like the legals of this. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're right. It is very, as people who grew up in Marvel versus DC, and you're right, having very distinct personalities of these two different universes, and it was very obvious when, two different universes, and now this is just one. It's definitely weird. But again, that's not that surprising. I guess they've always kind of done that with a lot of these crossovers. In fact, in a lot of ways, Marvel versus DC and Green Lantern versus Silver Surfer are the outliers, because they're the ones that make it distinct universes, and that aren't just taking place in the same Earth that we've just never seen other pieces of, where these other crossovers, again, play more fast and loose with it, and, it's the same New York, or now Gotham is in the Marvel Universe, or whatever the case might be, which is so weird for us, because we grew up with a very different version of that.
Right.
Like I was flipping through the Silver Surfer and Green Lantern, like it's very specific because it's written by Ron Mars and literally ends with a page leading into Marvel versus DC or DC versus Marvel. That one very clearly has rules, whereas a lot of these other ones did not necessarily have rules.
Yeah, so it was certainly not a turnoff to me, and I just seem to have a lot of leeway with these books anyway. Part of me was disheartened because I thought the story, and at least some of the characterization, was important enough for the X-Men that it was a bit sad for me to go like, well, they can't reference this. Like, no one can talk about this. This will never be brought up in another X-Men comic. It's a side story. It's a guide end, and it's just going to sit there. But I found myself not caring as much, I suppose, towards the end, because I was just enjoying what I was getting out of it, not having to worry or fret about it not connecting to the Claremont larger continuity. And yet, as a Claremontian story, this is very much a Claremontian story that tells Claremontian tales. So I'm still kind of, getting out of it what I hope to get out of it. I think Simonson's art more than you did. For me, it was a good combo of storytelling and, or the storyteller and the art. At least I enjoyed both of those things, but for you, not so much.
Yeah, I think I've really been racking my brain to figure out what it was about the art that I wasn't responding to. And I'm still not sure. I think part of it's that for something like a team up like this, feel like I wanted the characters to look less stylized and more house style at the time. Like I wanted them to look like the Teen Titans under Perez. It didn't need to be by Perez, but I wanted someone to be doing that style.
It would have looked great though. Like it would have looked amazing, right?
And I also wanted the X-Men to look a little bit more the way they would have at this exact time. And the extra style points or stylizations that Simonson kind of leans into, like I love Simonson's Thor. I think it's great, but I don't love his X Factor. And so I find his X Factor just something about the angles he uses, some of the line work, and I found that the line work I did not respond to in his X Factor work, I found present here, or some of the same choices. And so I realized that like he's definitely he has a style, and you can obviously point out when something is Simonson, but he is also a bit of a chameleon depending on the project. Because as I said, I adore his Thor stuff, and I look at that stuff, and I almost don't see the same guy. I do, because there's certain telltale pieces of how he illustrates certain characters, but at the same time, like it's just the angles are different. His approach was different, and so I found this harder to read. I thought at times, especially for a book of the time, I think what would probably have been so revolutionary at the time is think about how many pages don't make use of a white border, right? Where he just goes full bleed. And so I think at the time this would have been less common in art and so more exciting that you're getting some of these images, not every image, but like I think the first page and a few others, you have full bleed, you have the image leaping right off the page. There is no white border around it like there are on most pages. And I don't like those pages. I actually like the restrictiveness of that white barrier because there's just something about his art that when he's bleeding off, I found it too much, or maybe just something about the line work. I'm really struggling to find the words. I'm obviously not an artist, but I didn't respond to it as well. Now, that being said, there are some great moments that I really liked when you have Scott, shaking Robin's hand. That's a cool moment. I mean, they're just posing, but I love a good poser. That's why I like Andy Kubert so much. But like, I do like that moment, and it definitely looks cool. There's some really good shots that Simonson does of Cyclops' visor that feels very Cockrum in nature, that I really enjoyed. But at the same time, I'm not sure if he was always the best illustrator of Darkseid. I thought he did a great job on the source wall. I think that kind of really tapped into something that he was able to channel very well. And he did a whole New Gods thing eventually years later, and he did Orion. So like he plays in this space. I didn't love his Darkseid at this time though. But to be fair to Simonson, I think that Claremont didn't know how to write him either. And so I think the combination of not feeling like it felt like Darkseid, either Kirby's Darkseid or a more modern Darkseid, coupled with not always loving the art on Darkseid, made it harder to enjoy him as the principal villain.
Yeah, it's interesting that those comments about Simonson's art and your wish and desire for Perez, too, because like the cover is the one thing that when I first saw the cover, I thought it was Perez. I thought like it's very Perez-y in terms of like the very tiny minor details, very fine line work, a large scene of people all kind of running up across the page. And I don't have a lot of notes. I can agree certainly that the Darkseid looks better in statue form or on the wall than he does mostly in person, with the exception, of course, again, of the back cover where he looks fantastic. Most of the characters I'm either fine with or I enjoy. For me, my odd comment was, I guess, if you find it odd, is the domino masking on Robin. I just don't I find it kind of like too rounded, and yet the domino mask on the cover looks great on Robin. So he had more time, he spent more time with it. I don't know what it was. But for me, I love the energy. I love that he's clearly very drawn to the New Gods Kirby-esque stuff. Clearly inspired by Kirby. I mean, more than half the people were at the time, or directly drawing from him. Again, great comment about the Cockrum visor for Slim, and he does the same thing in X Factor a bunch. I love the visor effects. I love his penchant for large metal objects and ridiculous Kirby-esque technology and Titans, not the Teen Titans, I mean, but just like gigantic humanoids, robots. Mm-hmm. You can tell that Claremont gave him the birth to draw the stuff that he found interesting, or maybe he just put stuff in that he wanted to, but either way, it feel like, it seems like they work well together. There certainly are very, very loose pages though, right? Like the parademons often just kind of feel like thrown together pieces of meat. There are shots where characters are inconsistently drawn. You've got Kid Flash, who should look small and live, and then there are times when he just kind of looks bulbous, and not overdrawn or over-rendered, but like balloony, overly muscled. So you can see that he's taken his time on some drawings over others, and you'd think that maybe it would be better for him to take the time that he takes on Jean Grey's Phoenix Raptor. The Phoenix Raptor often looks incredible, and there's this one shot near the end where she's backflipping and the Raptor's flipping up with her, just immaculate. And then often Deathstroke will kind of like ho-hum, and like you said, Darkseid. But then they have this one page it's on a mesa in New Mexico. It says morning on a certain remote butte in New Mexico where long ago. And then I love this Claremont keeps coming back to these moments with Jean and Scott, right? About the first time they make love. It's on the mesa. In gentler, happier days, Scott Summers and Jean Grey consummated their love. And then Simonson has drawn just with so much detail this gigantic, phallic, missile-like machine that is destroyed almost like a few panels. Like, really is gone on the next page. It doesn't matter. But the time he spent rendering that, when you think to yourself, if he could spend half the time that he does on Scott's Visor and on giant machinery as he does perhaps on Deathstrike or maybe even Colossus, it would be a bit more balanced. But I do love that chunky wall stuff. His wall pictures are really good, and I think it's important that they're good because so much of the story is about. I'm reading this and I'm just thinking about like Grant Morrison. I'm thinking about a little bit of Alan Moore as well. These sigil magicians who are often, especially Alan Moore, who has written often about the space between or accessing emotion and spirits and intuition. And he likes to play with both those things, with like the logical, the concrete, the substantial, the physical. And then also, people that can tap into the magical part of existence, and Morrison the same way, of consciousness, intuition. And this is the wall that separates the two worlds, kind of literally breaking and cracking, and pure emotion, pure dream, soul is pouring through into the universe. And so the wall really is an important character. It's kind of as important as New York is. I will stop talking soon, I swear, but New York is drawn and is rendered very well often in this as well, which I do appreciate. The attention to detail that Simonson puts in here. So in terms of like setting, the cosmic wall and New York, I do feel it's situated quite often in a very concrete sense of place, which I do appreciate because it's also crazy, right? There's like a Beast Boy dragon and a super floating Mobius chair and them fighting on the moon or wherever they are. So those are things that I enjoyed greatly about the art.
It did, because obviously Claremont is the architect of the X-Men, at times it did feel like he didn't always know what to do with the Titans.
I can agree with that.
They end up a little samey at times, but they are a very unique, eclectic group of people, and they're not his guys. He's favoring the home team here. And that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it did, kind of stick out to me a few times. Even the fact that Deathstroke is kind of just used as an also-ran henchman for Darkseid, which doesn't really make sense for Darkseid, for either of them, really. But you just kind of, trying to be a little loose, just go with it. It's interesting that on the X-Men side, we only really get Phoenix. There's no one else. There's no flunky that's kind of connected to them. It's just Deathstroke. It's an interesting choice. Like, I'm just curious about, what thought processes Claremont had going in. I wonder if he ever considered any other villains.
There is the villain of Intolerance, which is only really mentioned in the news bulletins a little bit, and then in my volume, in our volume, page 295, when Kid Flash is talking to Storm and he says, "Your steel pal's a Russian?" ? Which the implied messaging there, I suppose, would be this is the Cold War era, so that's kind of a questionable identity. And then she goes, "And I am African, Kid Flash. Is that important?" It's just an off to the side conversation that's happening that Claremont gives a quick nod to the fact that there is bigotry against X-Men, and then there's kind of a related ethnic bigotry or intolerance that's kind of being nodded at. But yeah, it's not actually that X-Men-y in that regard. It's not have a ton of that. It really is the Gene Show, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. No, and it's interesting, as you said, like, we obviously grew up, or, you know, we were kids when the Cold War would have ended, so our interpretations and feelings about Colossus will never have anything to do with what someone would have felt at the time. You know, in late 70s, early 80s, and you're reading about this character who's coming from this collective in the USSR, and it's just a very different interpretation. So it's interesting that they kind of take a moment for Beast Boy to be like, hey, like, what's up with this? That obviously would have been very other at the time.
And those are the fun things I enjoy about Claremont's stuff. I don't love his, again, and there's a reason for it. Everyone's comic's their first comic. I get it. Sometimes he can be overwrought with the narrative text. I do appreciate that he has a setup that he likes to use, which is to diegetically show the audience what the powers of the characters are, and the Danger Room is usually that vehicle. They're going to be training in the Danger Room, and then you can see what their powers are. He gets a little bit better at that as time goes by, and especially once he gets into Excalibur, he's very clearly better at that. So this is a little bit overwrought, but he tries to introduce the Teen Titans the same way. They have some kind of thing. They have a fight sequence, so they get to introduce their powers that way as well. Like, those things are nice. But Thought Balloons, really, I never knew I missed them until I went back and was reading more of the Claremont stuff. I really enjoy his work with Thought Balloons, especially when they're just little asides and a little glimpse into their mind. This is a side conversation. So this is, again, some of the things I do enjoy about his style. When he's having little side conversations, and if you're there for the plot, it's there front and center on the page, and you read it. And if you want to give some time to this small little conversation that's not even zoomed in on between Kid Flash and Storm, there's actually something there to unpack. There's actually something there to deconstruct. I agree with you that Darkseid is mostly kind of either not particularly interesting or he's out of character. There's one moment once he's captured everybody and he's drawing the force of the Phoenix out of them, that he has this like poetic moment where he's reflecting on like the youth and innocence. And he kind of has this, and I'm not the most familiar with Darkseid himself, so you can tell me if this is even anywhere close to being accurate. But I love the Claremontiness of this, because Kitty goes, "You're the thing from my nightmare. You're real." And he goes, "I am indeed. Adults deny me, but children know me for what I am, what makes them dangerous and worthy to be cherished. For in their innocence lies the universe's salvation, and in the loss of that innocence, my ultimate victory." So it sounds a little overly kind of poetic for maybe Darkseid, from what I'm familiar with, but very Claremont, very Shakespearean, very Baroque, very kind of like romantic. This idea that he is this ancient evil and his greatest foe is possibly the innocence of children. It's just like, I was not expecting that. So there's these fun moments that pop in that I wasn't ready for, but that's not really Darkseid, right? Is it?
Not really, no.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
What's interesting, I don't know exactly when in 1982 this came out or when they would have been working on it, because I was like, well, like, why not use Magneto? Like, Magneto feels like the easier villain to use, because Dark Phoenix is dead, so you have to like come up with this convoluted plot just to be able to use Dark Phoenix. It seems like a lot. And when I look at it, like 1982, you start the year, I think it's like Uncanny X-Men like 153 or so. So like, you've just done a big Magneto storyline. So maybe that's why, that he just kind of steered away from doing that. But it is curious that like the biggest, most recognizable villain that there is doesn't use him. Instead uses a character that's already been dead at this point for about a year or so. But what's interesting also about this particular year in 1982, we get a comic in Uncanny X-Men that has Dark Phoenix on the cover. And which, so again, at the same time you have Uncanny X-Men 157. It just says, "It's Phoenix, but she's dead." And it's like, surely you know that Phoenix dies, will need to be reborn again. Now, I already can't remember this issue, so I can't remember what the context is of this, but it's just interesting that in the same year, you get that at least cover, and then you also get this miniseries this crossover one-shot, again, focusing on Dark Phoenix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like Claremont. I mean, Claremont does like to go back to this well. I mean, obviously we maybe many of your listeners are familiar with the big Jim Shooter disagreement, row, controversy between Claremont and of course the editor-in-chief. And then he's still on this book, right? Jim Shooter's still here. Perhaps even at this point, Jim was like, look, you have things you still want to work out with Gene or things you still want to say. Maybe I have no problem with that because that was a very well-selling book, a very good selling book, but very well regarded, especially, a year or so later. So it seemed like perhaps, that's been my guess, that this is for many X-Men fans, absolutely a reason to buy the comic because she saw the cover and that maybe seemed to do well. I don't know what sales figures would be, but I wouldn't be surprised every time Claremont tried to do another kind of, maybe Dark Phoenix is back. There might have been a spike in sales even just because of the interest, because she's so legendary so quickly, isn't she?
No, absolutely. We talked briefly before about, that there's a lot of the smaller character bits. A bit that does happen a few times in Teen Titans and then is used again here on page 297, is Starfire kissing Colossus. So she can learn his language and then Kitty be calling her a hussy, which I appreciated. I don't think any teenager calls anyone a hussy per se, but I appreciated that in particular. And again, it was one of those smaller character pieces that they didn't need to do because again, Claremont, especially in this series, is a lot less about the big plot and more about the smaller character interactions, which he does succeed at, but it, to me, made it also a little bit less, I don't know, if you're going to get these two big teams together, I want them to be crossing a dimensional divide to meet each other. I don't want them to already know about each other. You know what I mean? Like, I want it to feel like a bigger event, and I felt like, and again, I didn't get to experience this in 1982. 1982, this was the event. This was exciting. But I've lived through JLA Avengers. I've lived through Marvel vs. DC. I've seen a lot of things similar but done differently, and I would argue more grander, at least, in terms of the scale they did them on. So in that way, this was not a letdown, but just very functionally different. But it does play into Claremont's strengths as someone who loves character.
Yeah. And Raven is interesting, too, because of the time that she gets. Obviously, Claremont is drawn to a lot of female characters. Storm is his favorite or one of his favorites. I'm surprised at the restraint that he has with Storm. She gets almost no airtime, gives a lot more to Raven, which, again, is good that at least a member of the Teen Titans team gets some attention. And she's almost like the opposite end of the coin of Phoenix at one point, right? Dark Phoenix calls her sister at one point, that there's something about you that is so powerful. My Dark Phoenix energy and what Claremont has called in interviews, ultimately her quest for the cosmic orgasm, right? This kind of like her lust, her desires, her passions, as they don't refer to it that way. They call it passions and sensations in the cartoon. She's going for bigger and bigger and bigger sensations and experiences, and it's destructive, right? It's very selfish. Whereas Raven's the opposite, right? She's the empath. She's not selfish. She heals other people. But coded in this kind of dark coloration, color scheme or tones, which makes me think about, this quest that Claremont seemed to have been on, and it's in his notebooks, and it definitely kind of almost comes up. It gets kiboshed a little bit in the Mirror Island saga. Near towards the end of his run, it looks like he's trying to set up, and other people have spoken about this at some length, who are more, aware of Claremont's writings than I, but, that for a while it seems like Claremont was working on this idea of the Phoenix being the life force, destructor and life force that exists in the cosmos, and then there's a dark force. And the dark entity, it seems like he was making Amal Farouk, was that the Shadow King is a cosmic blackness, darkness, shadow entity that is the opposing or antithesis to the Phoenix. And it almost, I don't know if he was intending this at all, but it did feel like for a time with the very abyss-like powers that Raven has, almost like Cloak from Cloak and Dagger, and then to have her mirroring with Phoenix, it was like, is he doing this now in 82? And then towards the end of the 80s of the Mirror Island saga, he'll try to kind of bring it back, and then it got kiboshed. His storyline got cut down. They told him he has to wrap it up. So that was an interesting thing just to think about in terms of like looking for Claremont really wanting to kind of lead with or be engrossed in female characters. He is playing here, of course, with Kitty. He uses Kitty a bunch. Again, Storm, I was surprised at how little. I do like the flirtation with Gar and Kitty. That's the two teenagers, really the younger teens. He's a much better match for her than the 19-year-old Colossus. But even on that page that you mentioned of Starfire, you get because later on you'll get Nightcrawler at the end pontificating and philosophizing, and he gets called out on it, right? Like Logan goes like, enough with the philosophy, elf, let's get drunk. But here in this kiss scene, you've got him, because we know that he's also a dashing, ladies' man. He is a Lothario, and so in the back she goes, "Oh, I can learn your language by kissing you," and then Kurt goes, Fräulein, speaking to Deutsch? Like, you speak German too? Do you want to? Like, he's lined up ready to kiss her too. So we don't get a ton of Nightcrawler. We know his powers, and you can get a taste of him. He's the philosophizer. He's the philosopher. He's the theologian. He also likes sex. He likes ladies. And then you get this cute relationship with Gar and Kitty, but also the jealousy that both Peter and Kitty will have seeing other people's affections aimed at their, I guess, the person that they're dating at the time. And then tons of stuff with Scott and Jean. It's so much. If you haven't read X-Men, if you're a DC fan, there's a lot you're dealing with, right? Like shades of herself, embedded in her friends. You're going to go meet her parents, who are these parents? She gets impaled with a beam of love at the end of her team, which again echoes what happened in the Phoenix Saga. So it is interesting how Claremont is both such a he's not a deconstructionist. He's very much a compact storyteller, and how much really when we're talking about this he puts in here. And you're absolutely right, though. It's tons of X-Men content. I do not feel I'm getting nearly as much about the history of any of the Teen Titans or of Deathstroke or of Darkseid from the comic.
I mentioned earlier kind of that at times that Simonson was channeling a little bit of Cockrum. Another really good panel where I think that kind of shows that is on page 261, where you have kind of Jean rushing over to Scott and turning to like vapor in front of his eyes.
I love it. Yeah.
Shot of him just kind of looking down and then blasting through his glasses, right? And that feels like, again, very much like something that Cockrum would do a lot of. So it definitely felt like channeling that, but through a Simonson lens. That shot of Jean going to Scott and fading out is just gorgeous. Like, and I gotta give props to the color work here, because the colors are really haunting as well as she kind of fades out and becomes more ethereal. That's a really, really impressive moment.
You know what made that panel of Scott shouting Jean all in red makes me think of? You're going to know this exact cover when I talk about it. You more than almost anyone. Andy Kubert's cover of X-Men 44, right? This classic, all reds, the two eyes glowing. Like, I wouldn't be surprised, right? If, again, Cockrum has done this as well, so this is Cockrum-esque. This definitely feels like a Kubert kind of like, hey, I'm doing it too. So I love that, and you know me, and so does Paul. I love an energy flare or a smoke coming from a visor. And so one of my most formative memories of that is Bacalo or Bacalo, however you want to say his name, X-Men Unlimited #1, with some great wispy smoke visor stuff from Scott. And there's a great panel in here of the team going through the caverns, I believe it is. And he's leading the team, and there's wisps of apparently ruby quartz energy can turn into vapor if you, I don't know. But this is page 303. I love how we're just like, are we peddling this Omni? Are we going to get paid for this? Cyclops there with the wisp, I'll say one more time, I can't stop talking about this, in Marvel vs. Capcom games and the X-Men Children of the Atom game, whenever you would move Cyclops back and forth, they animated this trail, this flickering trail of his visor that I just am in love with. So anytime that kind of thing happens, I will give points to the artists.
It's interesting, that moment that you shout out where, it's Cyclops saying like, we've arrived, people, end of the line. It's that particular panel is then repeated again once we get to the end of the one shot, where I guess they're just like, well, we have to have a page of filler to get it back on the right pagination. But it's literally like an empty page except for at the bottom of this panel. I don't know what anyone was thinking here. You could put literally anything on this page. It's a cool panel. I'm not saying the panel is wrong. I'm saying the fact that that's all that's on that page, but it's not even in the middle of the page. It's at the end. I'm like, was something supposed to be here? Did I get a weird bum copy? Is there something above this and everyone else's? Like, that's how odd it looks.
Which page? Can you give me a number so I can make sure I got the right one?
Well, it's right after the final image of Darkseid in the source wall, so I guess it would have been 319.
Oh, so it's that I didn't realize that was part of the comic. I thought isn't that just is that the collection doing a filler?
Yeah, it's the collection doing a filler, and I don't understand why this is what they chose.
Oh, I see now. Yeah. I didn't even think about this as anything. You're right. It is a blank page where they reproduced that panel. And why couldn't they have just done the "and lo, the crossover shall returneth" page from Mike Carlin? Why couldn't they have just done that immediately afterwards? I guess they would just have to have a filler anyway, following it. But I don't know.
Yeah, I guess at some point they needed the pagination to be a certain way. So especially if you look at the next major crossover, which is the Batman Punisher Lake of Fire, there's full double page splashes in there. So they have to make sure that things start to line up. So right. I understand it. I mean, you see this in a lot of trades. It's not a surprise by any means. It's more usually there's a cover or there's some sort of other material. Now, I don't think I have any, maybe I have one DC, published omnibuses. Most of my omnibuses are Marvel produced. This is produced by DC. So it's possible that this is maybe something they do a lot of. It's just an interesting curiosity, especially because on a banner at the top and the bottom is Marvel versus DC, which also bothers me because it uses the more modern DC logo, not the classic DC logo that would have existed during this period. So it's just weird. Plus, that logo is for a specific miniseries that's not in this book. A lot of weird little nitpicks. But even. It's interesting because I think that panel makes sense because this is supposed to be the last crossover we get for over a decade, right? So the fact that you have Scott Summers saying, "We've arrived, people, end of the line," that has a nice double meaning here. This is the end of the line, no more crossovers for another decade. That's what this means. I'm choosing to believe that's why they use this panel. But again, put it in the middle of the page. Do something a little different. Why is it at the bottom? It's more obvious to me that you've just thrown in some white space. Whereas if it was white space on either side, it would look more symmetrical. It would look better. Again, this is a very niche nitpick of a niche book anyway, but it did kind of jump out at me.
That's fun that Cyclops gets imbued with the Phoenix power here. That's something I learned today. Again, not in continuity, but now when you get to the Phoenix 5, okay, cool. There's a pattern there. It's a Claremontian first that, the team in AVX will later, I guess, kind of do a redux, do a return to that, and then give us, of course, several other characters who split with the Phoenix power. But yeah, to see him there with the Phoenix shield on his chest, shooting giant beams and screaming Jean, that's fun.
It's a fascinating page because, it's very much, Simonson channeling Kirby Crackle in terms of all the energy around Scott. And I think this is one of those things where the colors of the day probably were more limited, and these days you'd have a lot more lighting effects in what the Phoenix is doing as opposed to more generic kind of lighting effects off of them. You see everyone kind of watching, and then you see him, the fire kind of coming out. You see his optic blast kind of blasting through his visor as he's being overwhelmed, and then you have the last panel where it feels like Simonson just ran out of time, and you have Scott ripping off his visor and his mask. And then he has no facial features at all. I don't know what happened here. That bothered me because it's just, what's happening here? I'm
trying to believe his humanity is unobservable in this nimbus of pure light, right? Because he's both phoenixing and fully optic blasting. Paul would appreciate the remove visor reference here, where he's just giving his full, power thrust energy thing, and then the next panel is entirely just pink, solid. And I had to look at it more than once and even now I'm like, yeah, he is shooting a beam, but it's also a Phoenix Raptor. This combination, right, of him and his former lady love, all of their energies. I mean, he's going full Cable, right? Cable and Nate Gray. These are the energies that they harness, after they're born. But yeah, I can't say I love it, but if that's what he was going for, that he's now this cosmic entity, we can't even see his face anymore like a god, then that's cool. But I agree that the color limitations might prevented us from seeing maybe the full vision there. That pun unintended.
Yeah. The Raptor on the next page does look fantastic as it's really kind of leaping out.
Yeah, and the colors there work better. And of course, Claremont can't help himself. There's a concert in Central Park, and so the fireworks and combined with the Phoenix bird, he loves to do a grounding thing, an event, a concert, a pub, a bar, a gathering that he clearly has gone to, right? Like he's clearly gone to this. And so there's just so much time spent on, hey, by the way, there's a bunch of people gathered here in the park. And like, yeah, we get it, Chris. Like you've enjoyed some time there. That's cool. But as a New Yorker, I'm fine with that, right? Like those are those little moments, those grounding moments when the craziest stuff is happening, that there are people having a concert. So that's fun.
I did find it a little weird though that you have in that particular spot when the Raptor kind of first goes towards Darkseid. The coloring has it much more of like a pinkish purple, kind of like more psionic effects we'll see in the future. And then in the next page, it's just regular fire. Like that was just kind of weird. I also thought it was kind of a weird climax too, because we have it just kind of heading towards the source wall, but it's not even a great shot of the source wall because there's so much white space from the impact of hitting the wall that it makes even the detail of the one kind of face to the right of it not look as detailed, and so I do think it kind of felt like it was missing something.
Claremont has often been critiqued, and not necessarily in a negative way, for his use of psychosexual imagery and this idea of this man and woman combined together into one force. And with the pink coloration, to me, my interpretation is that's his visor combining, his pink visor, red visor combining with her. And then she separates from his body, right? And then just grabs Darkseid, and that's why she's back to yellow. But yeah, hitting that wall with all that white space, splooging, it's definitely it's kind of a messy, again, back to this Claremontian. Freud would have a field day with the imagery here. But I can see what you mean, right? It's overwrought. It overtakes any detail of the wall, at least to the credit of Simonson. He has drawn the wall multiple times in the comics so well that it's not like this is his only shot and we get it obscured. But you're right, it is a little bit too much white space there. Yeah.
Now there was supposed to be a sequel to this book. It didn't end up happening. The negotiations around Avengers versus JLA kind of derailed everything, and then nothing happened for over a decade. Until there was eventually, different people at the helm, and they were able to start, having fun again and doing crossovers. But it's interesting to wonder what would have happened if there had been a sequel. I'm curious if it would have been more DC heavy and more DC kind of leaning on their characters, maybe having someone from their side of the street actually writing it would have been intriguing. And again, you have Jim Shooter at the helm. Jim Shooter doesn't always play well with others. It's actually remarkable that some of these things even happened while he was around, just because of his nature. But yeah, I mean, this was fine. I didn't love it. I wanted to love it. I thought it would be a rip-roaring adventure, and I'd really enjoy it. And I found it at times very hard to read. I thought at times it played into people make fun of Chris Claremont's style of writing, but I found some of those foibles or things he leans into very much evident here. Sometimes they were charming, sometimes they weren't. As I already said, the art at times was hard for me to really enjoy and get into. I wanted the characters to feel different, and it just wasn't always there. You're showing me a shot of a very Cockrum-esque visor on Cyclops, which is all over this place. Like,
how great is that, though?
Cyclops gets some really good looks here.
For those of you with the collection yourself, we'll do that. I'll give you the page number again, 297. That's the Kiss page, but just an incredible. Yeah, love the jawline, love the nod to Cockrum. There's something about the crumbs, not the crumbs. There's something with the legacy that Cockrum leaves on this comic that, again, I'm a kid in the 90s not understanding it, just loving some of these shading techniques. Madrera, Joe Matt will pick up on this too later on. It's not just Bacalo. And they're all just kind of nodding back to some of these incredible visionaries of the comic. And I can't ever get tired of that. Can I be buried with an image of maybe his visor, of a Cockrum visor? Could you do that for me?
I mean, I think it would be wrong if you weren't.
Or maybe by then I can get like an actual visor prop that is somehow shaded like this exactly and just kind of have it on my mantle maybe, and then you can just throw that in the coffin or whatever, or the casket, or maybe I'll be cremated. Who knows? We'll talk later off air about how you're going to bury me.
This has gone to very dark and weird ways, but I'm glad that it brings out so much thoughts.
It's Dark Phoenix and Darkseid. It's got to be about that.
Well,
And
that is
mysteries,
fair.
the mysteries of what's behind the wall. You know, I love that. I love a good mystery. Love a good Kirby mystery. Love a good Kirby hat.
Mm-hmm.
Love that there's some good helmets in here. Although Darkseid's helmet was kind of a letdown for me. You got much better helmets of the New Gods than Darkseid.
Sure.
Not quite as fun. It's certainly not as much as fun as a Hela horned helmet or anything like that. But yeah, so I did enjoy my time with these almost shells of their real selves, these New God characters and these images. But it makes me want to learn more.
Okay, well then it was successful. It made you curious.
And I've told you this before. I would be interested to read the Wolfman and Perez. What do they call them? Teen Titans. At some points, and that hasn't been collected very well yet. But maybe DC's doing some new collections, or it hasn't been. Can I easily get it?
No. I mean, the first, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 issues have been fairly well collected over the years. They've had omnibuses, they've had classic collections. It's one of those things. I don't think they ever went full bore with it, but they collected much of the material. Now, it is now being republished as part of their DC Finest collections, which is DC's version of the Epic collections. Mm-hmm. So there is that. The first volume is not covering like the first year or anything. It's jumping right into the Judas contract, which is definitely the most famous storyline, probably to come out of the Teen Titans. And definitely
should I get that
one.
Should I get that and read that first, or should I hold off?
I would hold off. It's fun. I mean, you don't need it. You don't need you don't need to go in sequential order. I think there's a lot to it because it is like UNCANNY X-Men, a bit of a soap opera as well. So if you want to kind of be able to appreciate those elements the most, it would make sense to hold off and then be able to start with issue 1. Again, because it was a fresh start. It was a whole new team and a whole new, yes, there had been a Teen Titans before, but the new Teen Titans really jumped in and it felt like a new thing. And because you had new characters taking the forefront, like Starfire, Cyborg, and Raven, the focus was really on those characters. You obviously the other characters played a huge part as well, but you had these new focal point characters as well. So I do highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. I'm not sure if I'm going to get the Finest collection yet of the Judas contract. I've never collected any of the Teen Titans besides the Jeff Johns stuff, which is much more modern, although that's 20 years old anyway. I have always thought about collecting it in some way. I'm on the fence about it. I wasn't sure about getting any DC Finest. I just bought one that I was very much on the fence for. It had a crazy reduction in price, and I had to kind of jump at the opportunity. And I'm glad I have it. I have the Batman one that has year 1 and year 2, especially because it has year 2, which is not usually that well collected, which has Todd McFarlane artwork. It's not really in continuity. It's been forgotten. It's not like year 1 where it gets held up as like this, one of the best Batman stories ever. Mm-hmm. But even year 1 has the original colors, which is really exciting because I have it in, another trade, but that had more modern coloring. I didn't even realize it. And you know me, I love the original colors. I like to see books the way they were meant to be.
I agree. I agree with you.
There's just definitely something fun there. As we are recording, I just picked up a new Marvel epic as we speak that I got for $12-13, which is the Morbius epic, the volume
Canadian, 1. Which is like, I don't know, $2 American at this point. So, that's pretty good.
So it's interesting. So I could have paid I could have paid $20 and had what they call like their bargain copies, which is usually just remaindered copies. This one technically was used. It definitely has more of a feel of a wear to it. But it was $8 less. And I'm like, you know what? I don't even know if I care about this material, but I've never read it. So I'm excited by Marvel material that I have not read. I've read a lot of Marvel material over the years, but I've never read books like Giant Size Werewolf by Night, Vampire Tales, Fear. Like, I've never read this stuff. So I'm very excited to read things that are totally foreign to me.
Yeah, good deal. Why not? I do want you to get the Teen Titans books in the what is again? Sorry, what's the imprint again? The DC Epic
DC Finest.
DC Finest. So the DC Finest, which is not World's Finest, which I almost said. I do want you to get that so I can borrow it off of you. So, if you get tempted to get it and you're like, I'll get this, then I'll be lining up to borrow it off of you.
Interesting. So you were very much an enabler in this particular moment.
Yeah. But, well, I mean, I have been on the other side of you enabling me to get things that maybe I'm kind of hemming and hawing on. So why not return the favor?
Well, it's interesting that we should say that because I think there was a time where you were hemming and hawing a little bit about these two omnis.
I was. I am happy that I jumped in. I'm excited for my DC versus Marvel. That kind of got a little bit delayed for me. Things got screwed up with my order. But Adam, you were kind enough to, from a local store, make an order for me of the comic store exclusive cover, the Jim Lee cover. I know that you were having an adventure in your own mind going back and forth about whether or not you wanted to keep the original, the cover, or the standard cover, or get the Jim Lee cover, or both, because you have both ordered. But I'm happy to be the alternate Jim Lee guy, so you can have the more accurate of the era amalgam cover. But yeah, I'm excited to get that. I want to go through it and I want to talk to you about it in future episodes. And we have to get Paul involved because he's got to be involved. He's got to read some of this stuff with us.
This is true. Well, next month when we do our next Book of the Month Club, we're going to be doing a little bit more Valentine's themed. We'll be talking about, I think we were talking about Spider-Man Blue. I think that was positioned as something we should do. I believe Paul hasn't read it. I'm always enjoying any episode where you or Paul hasn't read something yet because I love getting a new perspective on things. In this case, you have read Blue, so you and I are old hat, but he is not. So I'm really interested to see. Hopefully, he's able to make that episode. If it's just you and me, it'll be less exciting because we already know Blue. But it'll be nice to reread it as well.
Hey, Adam.
Yeah.
Hey, we should split a Marvel versus DC omnibus for Paul.
Right? You mean the amalgam?
The amalgam, yeah. Yeah.
I've thought about it.
We should just do it. And maybe he won't like it, but he's not going to listen to this episode anyway. He's not going to hear this conversation.
No, he'll never know what we're talking about. He'll never know that this came up and that there are people out there who know what he may or may not end up getting at some point. We're going to have an extra copy. We could just write a copy and give it to him.
Write into the show if you want us to do that for Paul. Tell Adam that that's what you want as a listener, and maybe we'll have to do it.
We in general, the three of us, are big fans of being whatever that thing is, bros, Spidey bros. Which epic was it? Venom Epic Bros.
Venom Epic 2. It was Volume 2, not even Epic 1 of Venom. Yeah, we all got.
Well, I would never want one because I have all that material in my Amazing Spider-Man epics.
But Paul, it just kind of showed up, and we're like, "Here we go," and he's like, "Thank you. I mean, this is cool. I like Venom, but and we're all like, "Look, we have our own." And it's like, this is so dumb, but yeah, it would be good. And if anything, I think he would prefer the Jim Lee cover for Amalgam.
Yes, he would. I think he would. Yeah, I think you're right.
That's something that we need to do.
Well, I guess that's it'd be interesting to see if anyone sends in messages about get this for Paul.
Guys, send him an email, okay? Like, make fake email addresses and send them to him. So, like, you can send more than one. I mean, you can send like
absolutely. 7. Well, Nate, thank you once again for coming back for a Book of the Month Club. This was a lot of fun. I did not love the issue, but I didn't hate it. It was just it was the middle of the ground for me. It was enjoyable. It had its moments. It just didn't quite. I think part of it is probably it's been built up over the years as being like this great crossover, and the crossover that really worked and felt like it was less silly than previous. The previous crossovers had been very much 70s books, and yet this is an 80s book. It's more modern. It's more, and I think that's probably is true. If we ever look at, Spider-Man, Superman, that's not going to feel this. It's not going to feel like an 80s book. It's going to feel like a 70s book. It's going to feel like it has a certain vibe. So I think that because of reading about it all these years and seeing like that, Who Summons the Dark Phoenix panel is reprinted all over the place. I remember seeing that in Wizard magazine. Like, I think that's part of maybe the lunch bag letdown for me is I wasn't truly able to take this without knowing context. And everyone loves this thing. And if I had just been able to just experience it without knowing what other people's thought of it and have read about it all these years, I probably would have enjoyed it more. But as a result, it just didn't quite live up to the overblown expectations over years and years of reading about it.
Well, I had fun too, and I hope we do more of these. I'm looking at, Superman Fantastic Four, which is, Dan Jurgens, and it's got the cyborg in it. So, I'm down to read that with you. And of course, we've talked about McDaniel's Batman Daredevil crossover. And, of course, I've never read the Spider-Man Superman that you have mentioned a few times, but then it goes to the JR Batman Punisher, which I really want to read because there's so much rain in this book, Adam.
He lives in the rain. Yeah,
that's good. It's grimy, it's rainy, it's dark. These boys are wet in the rain, and they're punishing and they're batting. It's great.
Well, thanks again, and thanks to you out there for listening to this episode and listening to us meander about Uncanny X-Men and the new Teen Titans. You can email us at comicshenanigans@gmail.com. You can rate the show on Apple Podcasts, listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and also listen to us on Spotify. Intermittently throughout this episode, unfortunately, there was a little bit of a little person was trying to get my attention, so I apologize if that was very obvious in the audio, that my young, almost 6-year-old daughter kept trying to make an appearance, so I do apologize if that affected the audio quality for anyone out there, and I appreciate your indulgence. But thanks again for listening, and we will catch you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.